Greetings, everyone. Good morning to you all. A lot of friends here, a lot of people I've known a long time, a lot of new faces, but not anyone who hasn't had to answer the questions you have to answer before you attend something like this these days. I see a lot of very vigorous elbow bumping going on around the room, so thank you so much for being here. I'm Fred Kemp. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, and I just want to note that today's discussion is on the record, and it's also being live streamed. The talking that we've been doing in the Atlantic Council the last 2 weeks about moving to more virtual meetings, moving to more potential over time telework, has actually driven home for us how important the technologies we use are, because we're actually finding that a lot of our work we can do so effectively, but a lot you can't. And bringing this kind of community together around this kind of event just doesn't work quite as well with faces on a screen. So thank you for joining us today. It's a very important day for the Atlantic Council. We don't launch all that many new centers, certainly not in a cutting edge field like this, and I'm glad you're here to help us celebrate. The creation of the GeoTech Center would not have been possible without the unwavering support of GeoTech founding partners. So I also want to take a moment to acknowledge them for their trust and for believing in our vision from the start. This has been months in the building, I would say even years, because we've been working on disruptive technologies inside the Scowcroft Center for some time. So thanks very much to Accenture, and we have a really good group here from Accenture, for Carnegie Mellon University, SIGPA, and the Rockefeller Foundation. Thank you all, and also for Amazon Web Services. We've got Paul Doherty, John Goodman, and Robert Hoffman representing our Accenture partnership here, so welcome. It's an honor to have you here, all of you, and you'll hear more from John and Paul a little bit later on. I also want to give a special thanks to the entire Accenture team, John, first movers in terms of this partnership, and it's just been terrific to work with all of you, and you've been champions of this GeoTech Center. I'm also pleased that Dean Ramaya Krishnan, Daryl Weinert, and John Nelson are joining us from Carnegie Mellon University. The university has come on as our founding knowledge partner, and as you know, CMU is really the go-to university in the field of artificial intelligence. So thanks to Dean Krishnan for his support, and he'll be representing CMU on the GeoTech Commission. We also have Kevin O'Neill from the Rockefeller Foundation. It's a pleasure to have you here today, and so glad you could make it. I know this is a really busy period for you to do your board meetings, so Kevin, really appreciate the time to be here today and represent Rockefeller Foundation. Raj Shah is on our board. Zia Khan will be joining the GeoTech Commission, so we're really delighted by all of that. And Jane Hall Lute is here representing SIGPA. Jane, you here yet? She's not here yet, but she'll be here soon. She was just on the phone. I just got off the phone. We had the meeting of our security committee today of our board, and she's on the security committee. It's the scariest security committee you could ever have. Steve Kappas from the CIA, Mike Morrell from the CIA, Jane Hall Lute from Homeland. I mean, they see threats where. Well, anyway, let's not go there. And we don't have Teresa Carlson from Amazon Web Services, but we're really delighted that she's going to join John Goodman as a co-chair of the GeoTech Commission. A very big thanks also we'll send through Jane to Philippe, Christine, and our colleagues at SIGPA. I also want to have a huge thanks to Congressman Mike Mccaul, one of our honorary co-chairs of the GeoTech Commission, and you'll hear from him in a moment, and thank you, Congressman, for being here today. Having Capitol Hill's perspective on this important body of work will add a dimension to the conversation and ensure we have a well-rounded discussion. We hope the Commission's report will come out around the time of the election to inform our legislators, our public officials, after the November election. Special thanks goes to our other honorary co-chairs, Senator Mark Warner, Senator Portman, and Congressman Susan DelBene. They're enthusiastic about the commission. This is an all-star cast, Congressman, to have as co-chairs. They had previous engagements. Congressman DelBene was going to be here with Congressman Mccaul, but she unfortunately had to cancel her participation due to the coronavirus outbreak that's particularly hit her district hard in Seattle. On that note, thanks to all of you for complying with the extra screening steps we took to protect the well-being of staff and visitors. We appreciate your collaboration as we work through this. We see this period as a challenge and an opportunity for the Atlantic Council, a challenge in the sense that we have to keep our community safe, we have to keep our staff safe, but it's an opportunity in the sense that we can really, it's times like these that the work of the Atlantic Council is most required. We're convening today's launch at a time of extraordinary uncertainty and change, particularly in the technology space. New and emerging technologies are already having a massive impact on the way we live and function, and this is only going to grow. Some will see this change as a zero-sum game, who's going to win, who's going to lose, but we're talking a lot here about technology for good, and we believe these changes also hold plenty of opportunity for collaboration, and we're going to work very hard at that. Opportunities to improve daily lives, strengthen economies, and foster a more prosperous and peaceful society. From urban development, transportation, manufacturing, medicine, education, public safety, emerging technologies can be harnessed for good and improve our societies. But the Atlantic Council was also created to take a look at risks, and we're going to take a look also at the world of risk. And should we fail to understand the full range and impact of these technologies can and will have on geopolitics, markets, and societies, then we'll have failed to do our full job. So this is also where the GeoTech Center comes in. By tracking these technologies, the emerging technologies, the center will ensure top decision makers have the solutions, policy recommendations, understanding they need to maximize the enormous opportunities afforded by today's cutting-edge advances while minimizing the risks. We're also establishing a GeoTech Commission, as we said, to steer and advise the work. This commission will produce strategic data and technology recommendations that companies and policymakers can pursue to adapt societies and open markets to this evolving world. The commission will feature international partners from both the public and private sector, including CEOs, senior executives, academic deans, subject matter experts, and other distinguished thought leaders. A testament to the commission's nonpartisan nature, it will include these 4 members of Congress, as I mentioned. So once again, thanks to the co-chairs and commissioners. I'd now like to turn to Congressman Michael Mccaul, who represents Texas' 10th Congressional District, which stretches from Austin to Houston. He serves on the Congressional High-Tech Caucus and Congressional Cybersecurity Caucus. Congressman Mccaul has previously served as the chairman of the House Committee on Homeland Security. As chairman, he introduced numerous bills to ensure that the Department of Homeland Security has the best policies and resources to carry out its mission of protecting the American people, including legislation to enhance cybersecurity, counter weapons of mass destruction, and prevent emerging threats. So thank you all for being here. And Congressman, thank you most of all for coming here today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Fred. It was nice to give you an elbow bump. Just want to thank the Atlantic Council for its great leadership. I'm honored to join the GeoTech Commission along with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, which I think is very important today. And, you know, as we go through this crisis right now, and we talked about the Atlantic Council giving Congress a report on pandemics and how we respond. I always found when I was chairman of Homeland, as you mentioned, and I went through the Boston bombing to terror attacks and Paris, Brussels, in the United States, that always in times of crisis, cooler heads prevail. And that's true with terror attacks, it's true with hurricanes, and any emergency situation, that panic is not our friend. I think that we need to stay calm, cool, and collected when we have times of crisis, and face the crisis head on with solutions to it. I want to start, and I now am the what's called the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. So I sit, that's a very interesting position to lead, or be the lead Republican on foreign affairs, with so many things happening in the world, particularly when we look at Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. I know the focus is on technology and China, and I just want to start out with an anecdote, a personal story. When I was a young federal prosecutor here at Maine Justice Public Integrity Section, I was put on the campaign finance task force, and I prosecuted a man by the name of Johnny Chung, who some of you may remember. Johnny was a bit of a comical guy, a little bit of a shyster. He made money off a tour company where he'd take foreign contributions and get Chinese nationals into the White House. But what was happening behind the scenes was more nefarious. When he cooperated with us and the FBI, his investigation led us to the director of Chinese intelligence and China Aerospace, and a woman by the name of Liu Xiaoying, who introduced Johnny to the director of Chinese intelligence, not a man well known in his own country like our CIA director is, or DNI. He pointed out with an array of different photos of Asian individuals, the two photos of Ji Shenda, which is one older, one younger version. We saw the Hong Kong bank account records from China Aerospace into his Hong Kong bank account that he then used to pay off his mortgage and then put into the Clinton campaign to influence the election. So in classic Chung style. But point is, people try to influence our elections for many years. But the cross-section between China Aerospace, why were they involved? Because of tech transfer. They liked the policy of stealing our technology. And the tech transfer technology and satellite technology was very important to them. That was 1996. Here we are in 2020. And we've seen decades of deception by the Chinese, where they've stolen such a great wealth from this country of intellectual property. And now we are in a competition when it comes to artificial intelligence, quantum computing, cyber, and 5G, which I'll be talking about in a minute, that I'm focused on quite a bit on the Foreign Affairs Committee. Now, we have to compete with China, and we have to win, and we are in a race. And we're truly witnessing a remarkable change in our society, driven by technology advances. And it's only right that we in Congress and in the private sector, you, come together to try to drive policies that will enable this revolution while protecting our shared values of privacy and intellectual property rights. Bad actors like China do not abide by these core guiding principles. In fact, I think it's a cultural thing. Intellectual property doesn't mean much to them. And why invent when you can steal? Moreover, the Chinese Communist Party is subverting market rules and the rules of law by monopolizing emerging technologies. Another cornerstone of their efforts is stealing American ingenuity, our innovation. And in fact, the FBI has more than 1,000 open intellectual property theft investigations, and almost all lead back to China itself. They also stole 20 million security clearances, including mine, and I'm sure many in this room. FBI Director Christopher Wray told Congress recently, there is no country that poses a more severe counterintelligence threat to this country right now than China. Secretary Pompeo told me that China is the greatest threat long-term to the interest of the United States. Retired General Keith Alexander, former NSA director, called this the, quote, greatest transfer of wealth in human history. China is using every tool at their disposal to gain an advantage over the United States and spread their malign influence worldwide. In no other area is this competition more consequential than in cutting-edge technologies like quantum computing. As many of you know, quantum is key because it will unlock the potential of other cutting-edge technologies like artificial intelligence, 5G, and encryption. And the first country to get quantum first will rule in data. Just like the race to the moon, quantum computing is the space race of today. In order to compete, the United States must empower the private sector through research and resources. In addition to China's debt trap diplomacy, their One Belt, One Road initiative, their influence is playing out at international organizations such as the United Nations, where China is coercing other nations into supporting their agenda. The United Nations has 15 specialized agencies that support its work. Of those, four of those are headed by Chinese nationals, and the same number led by the United States, France, and UK combined. Moreover, China is using these positions to their advantage. I'm happy to report that the administration has been successful in beginning to rebuild U.S. leadership at the United Nations. And just last week, Secretary Pompeo announced that our preferred candidate was nominated to lead the World Intellectual Property Organization, the committee charged with protecting intellectual property. This is an important and huge victory given China's rampant theft of American ideas and technology. In fact, the leading candidate before ours came into the race was actually from China. Can you imagine if the Chinese controlled and led the World Intellectual Property Organization? That's like Iran being on the Human Rights Council at the United Nations. We must apply the lessons learned here and at other international forums that the Chinese hope to control and head their malign influence. Chairman Xi publicly stated that he views high-end technology like 5G as a, quote, national weapon. The CCP is trying and succeeding in manipulating global rules to unfairly advantage its companies and gain access to data. We must come together to empower technology advancement and counteract the very real threats posed by the CCP. The good news is that we're here together today. The people, after decades of deception, a deceptive campaign, are waking up to what China's been doing. And I think the world is waking up to what China has been doing. So we are here discussing ideas to advance technology and benefit society while maintaining our principles of the rule of law and right to privacy. My colleagues and I in the United States government are ready and willing to advance the ideas that come out of this bipartisan commission and make America stronger, safer, and smarter. And again, I want to commend the Atlantic Council for this commission that I think will be very helpful. And this is something where, whether it's myself or Senator Mark Warner, we have dealt a lot with technology issues. I just don't see this as a Republican or Democrat issue. It's an American issue, first and foremost. And that's where y'all have such a great opportunity and role to play in the private sector to help us in the Congress advancing great ideas to make sure that we can be competitive with China. Because we can say how bad they are all day long, but the fact of the matter is, if we're not there competing, we lose. When I talk to ambassadors in Africa, I say, why do you do business with the Chinese? They will come in with their debt trap, they'll exploit your natural resources, and then they will bring in their own workers and then over-leverage you and eventually take over your ports or your country. They are aware of this, but their answer is, Congressman, because you are not there. Simply put, we need to be there. And we've done things like the BUILD Act and the DFC, the Development Finance Corporation, to help stimulate American interest and American business abroad, both in Africa and in Latin America, where we see a real China offensive taking place right now. Who would think the Panama Canal that Teddy Roosevelt built and Jimmy Carter gave back would have ports on both sides of that canal owned by China? So I think it's time to wake up. I think the good news is we are finally waking up to this threat, and working together with the Atlantic Council, we will provide solutions to that threat. And thank you so much for your leadership. Thanks for having me here today. Appreciate it.
Congressman, I know that Senator Warner would have been the first one to applaud your your comments and align himself with them. As much as we want to work on technology for good in the GeoTech Center, we understand part of that is going to be looking at standards, international cooperation agreements, et cetera, that will combat and prevent, to the extent possible, technology for bad. So thank you very much for those comments. They're terrific. Bless you. and an elbow bump to all your staff, too. Thank you. I want to now turn to John Goodman, Chief Executive of Accenture Federal Services. Prior to joining Accenture, he served for 5 years in the federal government as Undersecretary for Defense, Deputy Undersecretary for Defense. He was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense for Industrial Affairs, and also a member of the staff of the National Economic Council, the White House office responsible for coordination of economic policy. He previously served on Harvard Business School faculty, where he has an MA and his PhD, so a real slacker. John will serve as co-chair of the GeoTech Commission. Most importantly, he's on the Atlantic Council Board of Directors. Perhaps even more importantly yet, he's a husband-wife dream team of board members of the Atlantic Council, and so it's really good to have Sherry here as well, so thank you so much for being here. John, thank you for your support. Thanks again for the whole Accenture team, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts.
It is really exciting to be here and to see us on this day. Welcome. You know, I was going to say we're living in a time of unprecedented change, and then I realized first it's a truism, and second I remember sitting with my grandmother as she was trying to get me to explain to her how to use that cassette tape machine because she just couldn't figure it out. So I'm not sure whether we actually are living in a time of unprecedented change. But I think what is certainly true is that we're living in a time when change is proceeding ever more rapidly. New technologies are changing how people work and live in ways that we are just beginning to understand. Just think about all the ways that AI is permeating our everyday lives. And we don't even think about it. You know, from your smartphone to your car, from your healthcare to your finances. Commercial companies have embraced artificial intelligence and are applying it at scale to deliver real benefits and significant cost savings. In government, by contrast, AI is just in its infancy, but we already see incredible potential. By our estimates, artificial intelligence could unleash $500 billion in productivity gains from federal workers by just 2028, automating repetitive tasks and freeing up time for higher value-added activities. And we are just getting started. Now, these seismic shifts in technology also have geopolitical impacts. Indeed, as the Congressman noted, perhaps not since the space race have we seen similar security and competitiveness impacts from the introduction of new technologies. But there's some key differences. In the space race, there were just two principal players because the barriers to entry were so high. Now, perhaps with the exception of quantum computing, many of the new technologies are very different. We're dealing with both state and non-state actors because the barriers to entry in many digital technologies are far lower than they are in space. And the potential impacts, I believe, can be even greater. The fact that these technologies affect not just our economy and society, but also our international competitiveness and our national security, mean that we need to think through strategies for both the public and the private sectors. That's why the GeoTech Center is so important. The Atlantic Council has demonstrated an extraordinary ability to bring together partners across the public sector, the private sector, and academia, not just to talk about change, but to create actionable strategies for all three dimensions of our society, public and private sector and academia. And even more important, I believe, is to advance the economic and social values that are so important to us and the world that we want to live in. That's why we at Accenture, along with our fellow founding partners, are so excited to be a part of this initiative. I'd like to thank our honorary co-chairs and congratulate the Atlanta Council for putting together such an extraordinary group of co-chairs, as well as all of the commissioners who will be guiding the GeoTech Center's work. And I'd like to thank all of you for being here today for the start of this journey. Thanks so much.
Thanks, John, and thanks to your team again, and Robert Hoffman, to your team as well. This has been just a terrific experience. So we're putting out a press release. We have put up a press release today that announced the GeoTech Center and announced the GeoTech Commission. But frankly, neither one of those things is going to work unless we don't make the third announcement, which is the announcement of the director who's going to run the whole thing. It is my great pleasure. Oh, and by the way we hire our directors of our programs and centers is we really focus on intellectual entrepreneurship. So you have to have the intellectual chops to understand what you're going to do, and he certainly has that. But you have to be an entrepreneur in the sense that you have to get stuff done. You have to move the policy needle. It's not enough to think about it. I hate the term think tank because it's a nice first step, but it doesn't get you there. But you actually have to act upon your thinking, and this is what David is so good at. David Bray has a fascinating background ranging from private sector experience as a strategist for startups, U.S. government positions that include work at the Center for Disease Control, leading tech responses to September 11th, 9/11, anthrax attacks, as well as SARS, so he knows about what we're going through right now. He's also served as a senior advisor to the Department of Defense in Afghanistan and as executive director for the National Commission for the Review of Research and Development Programs of the U.S. intelligence community. Most recently, he served as executive director of the People-Centered Internet Coalition, as you know, is really closely identified with Vint Cerf. He serves as a faculty member at Singularity University, where he gives talks on impact and disruption. We like to do both at the Atlantic Council, while also guest lecturing at both Harvard and Oxford. Beyond his stellar resume, he's an innovative thinker, brilliant scholar, and an optimistic team player. We like optimists because optimists actually think they can change the world and will try to do it. We're thrilled to have him on board. He also, by the way, is a really gifted improvisational jazz pianist, which will serve him well in this world that will require a lot of improvisation. And I first discovered this visiting Nanotronics in Brooklyn. It's great to have Matthew Putnam here. Matthew's a really brilliant pianist and musician, along with other things. And he has how old is that Steinway?
1922.
A 1922 Steinway just outside his office, like I'm sure a lot of you do here as well. And David just sat down and started playing at the challenge of Matthew. And I didn't actually see that in his CV, but if I had, I would have hired you even faster. So David, the improvisational floor is yours.
I'll give you a fist bump. Thank you, sir. Well, that's a very humbling introduction, and it means that I just now have to rise to the bar to meet the occasion. I want to underscore what John Goodman said. Thank you, thank you, thank you all, members of the commission, members of the founding partners and partners that have made this happen, all of you for coming out today, especially in the midst of all this turbulent change we are facing. I was going to start with the remarks about it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And fortunately, I don't think we have Madame Guillotine happening outside, but I raise that because maybe it's always been the human condition that we have been facing both the best of times and the worst of times. In some respects, we've achieved dramatic reductions of infant mortality. In some respects, it's amazing. We're at 7.6 billion people on the planet, and relatively speaking, violence is down across the board. There are some estimates by historians that for the last 3,000 years of human history, you had a 1 in 4 chance in the medieval ages of being killed by a fellow human being. The average for human society as a whole was 1 in 10. Now it's like less than 0.001%. So in some respects, it's an amazing time in the human species. but it's incumbent upon all of us to make sure it continues to be that positive future forward. And as Representative Mccaul said, it's the choices we make. And it really is thinking about that we have not, for a long time with the Western world, figured out what do we mean when we say tech for good, when we say AI for good. What is that North Star? And maybe we can come together both in the United States and also work with our allies, because we are stronger with our allies, and define when it comes to people, prosperity, and peace, what specifically do we mean in terms of new technology, and even more importantly, data. Because we have to figure out data and new technologies. And once we define what we mean, we can maybe even find potential areas of working together with non-traditional partners, whether they be non-traditional partners in terms of nation states or non-traditional partners in terms of non-state entities and the private sector. So that's what we hope to do with both the Center and the Commission, is work together across sectors and define that North Star. When we say tech for good, what is it, what are those definitions, and how do we measure it? Because that's going to set the roadmap for the next 10 years ahead. I was also going to remark, Fred, when you gave me that humbling introduction, I don't think I've ever had a normal job start where the first 6 months went as planned. When I signed up the CDC's bioterrorism program, they kept on saying we were a Cold War relic, and it was scheduled weeks in advance to give a briefing on September 11th at 9 o'clock in the morning as to what we would do technology-wise if a bad day happened. Unfortunately, 8:34, the world changed. That briefing was canceled at the time. We piled computers into cars because that was the state of information sharing at the time, set up an underground bunker, didn't sleep for 3 weeks, stood down on October 1st, ended up briefing the CIA on October 3rd. First case of anthrax showed up 24 hours later. Similarly, when I signed up for the Institute for Defense Analyses, we have a colleague, Dr. Peter Brooks, here from there. It wasn't until about 2 months into the role I was told, guess what, you're going to Afghanistan. And so I did, after I said, can I first call my wife and let her know? So I did that. And then we also have Marie Sonnenberg, who was co-chair of the National Commission for the Review of the Research and Development Programs of the U.S. Intelligence Community. Interesting as to how I achieved that role. I took on a role, in theory, it was supposed to be head of information sharing for counterterrorism, the policy-related aspects. But I was told on day 2 we don't need policy. And then shortly thereafter, Stephanie O'Sullivan, who was the Deputy Director of National Intelligence at the time, said, would you like to lead a national commission that reviewed all the R&D efforts of the intelligence community? What she didn't tell me at the time is there had been 3 senior executives in 3 months before I took that role. Good news is a year and a half later, no one else was killed. But we do live in non-traditional times. And again, I want to underscore as we get ready to introduce the next panel, we have to figure out what do we mean when we say tech for good, whether it comes to the future of work, the future of data, the future of trust, the future of space, or the future of health. These are all areas that right now we in the United States have not come together to figure out really where we want to go with this. So it is my honor now to introduce the next panel. We're having it focus on the future of work and data. We'll have Paul Doherty from Accenture come on up. We have Dean Krishnan from CMU come up. John Stevenson from AWS come on board, and it's going to be moderated by Carolina Young from Senator Warner's office. With that, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to the Atlantic Council for hosting our office. Senator Warner has been a strong advocate of making sure that we have those bipartisan solutions for the future of work and the future of economic security and global security issues across the globe into the 21st century. So thank you for the invitation. And he sends his regrets for not being able to be here today. So with that, I wanted to make sure we kind of dive in, as quickly as we can. Paul has been thinking about these issues for a long time from that 30,000-foot level, and so I wanted to start with you and get your sense of where do you see sort of the role of technology and society leading us into a 21st century?
That's a broad question. I'd step back and say, David talked a little bit about this, and John did as well, but I think you need to recognize where we are in the evolution of a couple of things. And one is the evolution of the technology industry and what's happening with the technology revolution that we're in the middle of. When we use words like the fourth industrial revolution, I think we understate the impact of what's really happening. And since the invention of the transistor, or patenting of the transistor, which happened about 70 years ago, we're 70 years into an information and an automation revolution that is really at the knee of the curve and accelerating. And I think we're living through a unique time in human history as we really look at the impact that that technology has. So when we talk about exponential technology advances going forward, that's real. We talked about, Congressman Mccaul talked about quantum computing, that's real, artificial intelligence. We're at the very early stages of even things like cloud computing that we talk about a lot. Cloud computing, the global corporate adoption of cloud computing is in the 20% range. So even technology that's been around for a while are at the low end. So we have a massive technology revolution still ahead. And the important thing about this is, like every other technology revolution that's happened since agriculture, the steam engine, et cetera, this is changing us as human beings. We're living differently. We're operating differently. The quick question for you all is, how many of you checked your phones before your feet hit the floor out of your bed this morning? Be honest. Surveys would say 80% of you, so you're underreporting. And the same amount of you would check your phone before you went to bed. When you're in bed, people are checking their phones. It's altering. We're spending an average of 6.5 hours in front of screens every day. This is dramatically changing behavior in lots of ways that you all see. So the combination of the technology revolution that's at a very early stage with the way it's changing us as people is what leads to the importance of things like the Atlantic Council, the GeoTech Center, the GeoTech Commission, because it's in our hands to shape this right. The technology can be used for good or for bad, as we talked about earlier, and the more we can get ahead and give prescriptive advice to society, to governments, to businesses, to individuals on the right way to adopt the technology, the better future that will shape for all of us.
Mm-hmm. Right, and so with the potential for dramatic changes coming down the pipeline on the technology front, I think it's important to be focused on this sort of relationship between technology and the worker. You wrote Human Plus Machines, or you've been thinking about these issues for a while, and in the book you wrote about how companies are not really thinking as much as they should be about sort of the middle issues, the concept that there needs to be some imagination between that relationship and technology and the worker going forward. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, we published Human Plus Machine roughly 2 years ago, and there's Christian, my friend here, is very much of a Human Plus Machine thinker as well. But so we share a lot of passion and conviction around this. And the reason we wrote the book was what I saw too many dialogues in business and government, in academia and elsewhere, where the discussion was about artificial intelligence, automation, blockchain, quantum computing, all these technologies, and how they were going to put people out of work. And people are talking about the era where you didn't need people anymore. I strongly disagree with that idea, and strongly disagree that that's really the future that we're moving into. Rather, it's about, like any other technology we've ever identified, this is about how humans do things better and how we empower humans. And of course, you need less humans to do certain things, but you need more humans doing other things as you look at the disposition of how this plays out going forward. So we did a lot of research. We talked to thousands of companies, many thousands of workers, and did a lot of research of the book. And I think make the case convincingly in our view that the future is really one about two things, really reimagining the role of people, the role of the human in the way work is done. We came up with a concept we call the missing middle, which is the way jobs will look in the future, a new prescription for jobs. And it's different types of new jobs that we're now seeing appear at scale in the economy. Things like a digitally enabled oil field services worker, that you rather than just turning the dials, using digital tools and equipment and having physical skills in the oil fields to do their work. Many other jobs that you wouldn't anticipate, and that's really what we believe the future of work is. The second key point of the book is that future won't accrue in the right way unless we reimagine the way we skill and train people, and think about new techniques, apprenticeships, new forms of education, new learning platforms that companies adopt to differentiate and distinguish their workforce is really the way of the future. So that reimagining of the way you do work and reimagining the way that we skill people is, we believe, the key to unlocking the value that's coming about with technology.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That's a great segue into Ramaya's work on this issue. And I know that Carnegie Mellon has been really at the forefront of rethinking and reimagining sort of that role between technology and workers. I've had some wonderful conversations with people at the Block Center. Can you talk a little bit about your work and the role that you see sort of Carnegie Mellon taking on in this space?
So thank you, Carolina. I lead a center called the Block Center for Technology and Society, and Carnegie Mellon University as a whole sees itself as really pioneering work at this intersection between technology and society, technology and humanity. If I were to give two particular examples to build off what Paul said, I mean, many of you talk to your phones today, many of you talk to Alexa today, and image recognition is at the point where it surpasses human capacity today. I think we'll find that on account of this COVID crisis that we're in, where people are going to be working remote and virtually, we'll find there are opportunities for figuring out what will work well when people work at a distance as well. So as these changes come about on account of technology, the idea of asking what set of tasks will technology substitute humans at, and what sets of tasks will technology complement and support, like the example that Paul gave of the oil services worker being digitally supported, that's going to come about, which means that the very nature of work is going to change, which then requires people to have and acquire new skills. So I think the biggest challenge, one of the key challenges, is how do we upskill and reskill? Everybody talks about upskilling and reskilling, but how do you do this with verifiable learning outcomes, and how do you do this in a compressed period of time when we know that the results from prior work, Nobel Prize winner Heckman talked about the fact that the earlier you intervene with children, for instance, the better the results. But most of the people who are going to need retraining and reskilling, the Heckman curve is a well-known curve in educational research, are going to be people who are 30s, 40s, 50s. So how do you really address the need for reskilling and upskilling? So this is a big challenge that we are taking on at the Block Center. And it's not just about people who are employed in white-collar work, the disadvantaged members of our communities. If you're not college educated, you only have a high school education, how do you impart in 6 months the skill sets required for a middle-class kind of job that'll give you a path to economic prosperity? I think these are very significant challenges that we're taking on. The other piece, and we can come back to this in more detail, is this idea of how do we really architect and solve for people being able to work effectively with AIs in ways that might actually provide value. And then how do we both provide people with the resources, by which I mean the money and the time, to actually acquire all these skills? It's great to say you need to upskill, you need to reskill. How are you going to pay for it, and how do they find the time to do it?
And that's a really great point. I know that Carnegie Mellon has been thinking about that training piece very directly within sort of the promotion of R&D, for example. So, historically we've had a relationship with training where we sort of implement the training program after the product comes to market. But Carnegie Mellon is really sort of rethinking that relationship with training. What if we incorporated that at the beginning stages of the R&D development in AI and other sort of places? Can you talk a little bit more about that in particular?
Right. I mean, oftentimes training is either training people for skills for which there might not be a market demand for. And if you have and give thought to training earlier on in the very process of the creation or the product or the service, then you can think ahead about the kinds of potential skill sets people might need, and thereby also think about the investments in learning science and engineering that are required to actually impart these skills in the compressed amount of time. And then there's the public policy question or the business policy question of how are firms and the government going to actually support individuals in the acquisition of these skills.
And that leads me over to Amazon. So John, I'd love for you to, oh my goodness.
Trying to give him more space.
There's
a
no
gap
space.
in the back.
There's no space.
Yeah.
That was a good save.
Yeah.
So John, I'd love for you to give us your industry perspective on this, particularly the role of workers over time and that training piece in particular. Amazon does a lot of work on R&D internally, and so I'd love to get your perspective on that.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for the question. Also, thank you to the Atlantic Council for having me, and congratulations on the launch of the new center. We look forward to supporting and participating. Yes, workforce, talent are two very big things for Amazon. We can't be Earth's most customer-centric company. We can't build the future if we don't have the talent, to put our leadership principles into action, to listen to our customers, and build things like Alexa, like AWS. A lot of the work we have been doing, both internally and externally, like HQ2, like AWS Educate, has been specifically to, access the talent and grow the talent. We actually have a leadership principle as a company. Amazon has 14 leadership principles, which are kind of our guiding star, our constitution, if you will. And one of them is hire and develop the best. So not only do we want to be in a position to access great talent, but we want to cultivate and build and grow talent pools internally and externally so that we can build the future. And we tackle this problem like we do with any other problem. We start with the customer, work backwards, we think for the long term, and we love to innovate. We're not afraid to look down the dark alley and walk down it if we have to do something different. And it's okay if we're going to be misunderstood for a long period of time to see that bear out. The case, an example I'd like to use, and just one of the examples we're using to do that, is our AWS Educate program. And this grew out of a need that we had, kind of alluding to what Paul was talking about. We're only scratching the surface of cloud computing and how it's transforming the global economy. And with that transformation taking place by our customers adopting the cloud, by companies, partners like Accenture doing more work with their customers on the cloud, we're seeing some incredible things happen. But there's a problem. There's not enough cloud-trained practitioners available to support our customers, to work for companies, whether they be the government, nonprofit, education, startups, to be able to leverage these technologies to the full extent. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, translation, so on and so forth. So AWS Educate grew out of this problem of how do we get this workforce of potentially tens of millions of people around the world, different education levels. How do we get them upskilled? How do we get them to a level where they can take advantage of these technologies and work for these companies? So Educate was designed to bring people into the tech space without these technological backgrounds and get them trained on cloud computing. It's a global program of curriculum, and here's where it becomes very unique. It is not just curriculum to learn cloud, but curriculum to learn cloud to get a job in cloud, mapped to categories in demand where there is a clear need, something that our customers, our partners like Accenture would need, and to hire and tap into this talent pool. It is cloud-based, so it's online. It's available globally, available in, I believe, at least 10 languages, around 28 career paths, and continues to grow. We've got hundreds of thousands of students participating in now. And what we've also done along the way has been able to innovate and adjust as customer needs and demands change. So we started Educate, but as we went along, we heard from community colleges, excellent innovators and educators, see a need to get local workforces. I lead the state, local, and education policy portfolio at AWS. And community colleges, governors, policymakers were coming and say, how can we get all this talent in community colleges and local universities into the cloud? So we worked with leading schools in the Commonwealth of Virginia, like Northern Virginia Community College, to develop cloud computing degrees based upon our curriculum that are accredited degrees, things people in a community college, which is designed for working adults, people across a geographic area, so rural, urban, to get into these career fields quickly and have that accreditation. And we were able to do it because we had willing customers, we had that inventiveness culture, and we had the technology stack to back it up. So it's a very exciting time, I think, for us, and we're excited about where this is going and what we're doing with our customers.
If I could add a point, first of all, the work Amazon's doing on this front is amazing. Other programs like Deep Racer that you're doing to stimulate the mass education learning around artificial intelligence are really spectacular programs. One point, just building on the human-machine thing we're talking about, is I think the opportunity we have is to, and the right way to think about it is we're at a point where we can make technology more humans, and then we need to make humans more human. And the point I'm making technology more human is that the promise of artificial intelligence and digital agents and Alexa-like interfaces and everything, extended reality, virtual reality, is that we can allow humans to interact with technology in a more human way. So the technology becomes more human. Think about how crazy it is that what you do on your mobile phone today, which is you type on a keyboard that was designed in a way to slow down your cognitive processing so you couldn't jam physical keyboards on typewriters. And you're using your thumbs to tap on this little screen and we think this is great. And it's the amount of cognitive effort and wasted time we spend just trying to talk with a dumb device that doesn't communicate with us in an intelligent way is insane. And that's what's going to change with next generations of technology. If we think of technology and the challenge is making the technology more human, that's what unlocks the human potential. And then the trick is not to make humans more like technology, and I think we're not getting that yet in some areas of education. The point isn't to train humans to do technology better, the point is to train humans to be more human. The example I'll give you is something we're rolling out at scale for an airline right now. It's something for their counter representatives to use. That helps the counter representatives deal with human passengers in a better way. It's a screen that they see that listens to the conversation with the person who walked up, and an intelligent agent is actively providing suggestions and information to the agent so that they don't need to think about it or type or access the information. They can focus all their human attention on serving the human passenger more effectively and be aided by the intelligence and the fusion of the technology and the human capability into a single job is what we're talking about in human plus machine, and what the future looks like and how we really empower people. And I think too often we're thinking of the technology as one thing and thinking of training the humans to do technology, and that's missing the point of bringing the two together more closely.
That's great. And actually, that brings us back to some of the issues that John was talking about. And by the way, my boss will appreciate the shout out to the Northern Virginia Community College system. But in addition to that, you mentioned something about making sure that we prepare workers for different opportunities in the future. And my boss has been talking at length about how we need to be shifting towards a culture of lifelong learning. And I know Amazon has been thinking about these issues for a long time. Can you talk a little bit more about that, how you're sort of implementing that sort of thought process within industry?
Sure. So no, it's very important. In fact, again, going back to how our company is structured and operate, one of our leadership principles is learn and be curious, where it is incumbent upon each one of our employees, from our CEO down to one of our fulfillment center associates, and myself included, to always be constantly looking for ideas, inspiration, and learn latest trends, issues, skill sets. We're encouraged to do that, both individually and also their assets internally we make available to our employees to learn, grow, and develop over the course of their careers. Because let's face it, some people will come to Amazon and want to spend the entirety of their career there. I'm already 6 years in and I still love it. It's still fresh. As we like to say, it's still day one. But then there are some who may want to go work for another employer. A lot of employees from Amazon have gone to work for Accenture and vice versa. So what we have done is we've created programs so that all of our employees from Aws Educate, but also we have programs to teach people internally and also to teach people skills that they could use elsewhere. So for example, our fulfillment center associates have access to a program called Career Choice. This is a program we developed for our team to leverage the fact that they wanted to learn skill sets that could help them obtain jobs elsewhere at Amazon. So they could maintain their work but still learn the skills on site through classrooms that we provided, and we would prepay 95% of the tuition from schools they would go to. Some of the skills very relevant to career advancement. Maybe they wanted to get an IT certification, move from maybe Amazon Fulfillment to AWS, but maybe they wanted to do something for themselves. Maybe they wanted to learn robotics to go into that field for another employer. Maybe they wanted to learn nursing and go in and serve the community in health in their hometown. We've got a number of fields available, and we have the classrooms brought there. There's a whole host of programs around the world that we make available both internally and externally, and we've been pioneering and also even working with our customers to bring ideas like Career Choice to their workforces so they can leverage this lifelong learning opportunity and develop also programs that meet their needs, whether they're a large company, a small company, or someone else.
So if I might add something to that. I think as a society, I think we need to impart this learning to learn capability more broadly, starting with K through 12 and on to college and onwards, because individuals have to learn how to learn. One is the availability of content for them to learn. The other is having the mindset and the capacity to sort of learn new skills. And if we can start early and actually teach them that skill. It's like a meta skill of learning to learn. And then you impart that and you reinforce it over and over again over the course of your high school education, and if you go to college or if you go to a 2-year degree granting institution, then I think this capacity to learn over the course of your career, because we are living at a time when the half-life of things is relatively short, you're going to have to sort of do this over and over again. And this comes back to the question of, in some cases, I think the firm that you're with is going to invest in your upskilling, as Accenture and Amazon are doing. In other cases, you might, for your own volition, want to learn a particular skill because you think there's a market demand for it, or is something that excites and sort of excites you or interests you. And there, I think there's a question of, what's the right, is there an educational savings account of some sort that you could then use to tap into to acquire that skill?
Just to add to that, I think the way that we view it is we have over 500,000 employees and spend about $1 billion a year in training and learning platforms. We really believe in lifelong learning, continual learning at scale. And I think that's something that's important for every company. You don't have a choice as to whether to develop a learning organization and to invest in learning platform. The reason is that the jobs are changing so fast that if your strategy as a company is to find the new jobs in the market as the jobs change, it won't happen because you're going to need to create your own workers to fill those jobs. So the companies that have the learning ability to help their own employees advance, like the example I mentioned earlier, the oil field services example, somebody was working physical equipment and putting extensions of pipe in. If you went to the market and looked for this is a solution built on a gaming platform. If you're looking for a physical oil field services engineer that also understood gaming engines, digital visualization, and online analytical techniques, you'd get 0 candidates. You have to develop your own skills in the way that this is going, and those companies that develop that capability will have a competitive differentiation, and it'll be the right thing for our societies, our communities, and the workforce.
I think that's right. And thank you for bringing up the potential of savings accounts. I know my boss has introduced the lifelong learning and training accounts for this exact reason. So. And so to your point about making sure that we are giving workers the opportunity to find the opportunities that they're interested in, I think that that's a really important point. And so it kind of gets back to this sort of broader question: what are some concerns or issues that policymakers and people in industry should be thinking about in terms of those solutions for the future to make sure that we develop those relationships between technology and workers that are sort of self-sustaining and interested in that learning potential piece as well?
So if I could respond quickly on this, I think that there's an aspect of this on the supply side and on the demand side, right? So if you look at on the supply side, what kinds of training programs and opportunities for lifelong learning can be developed that are both targeted to individuals in ways that might actually benefit them, such that if they acquired those skills, there's actually a market demand for this. How do we have this responsive ecosystem of suppliers that create the content that would be appropriate for the needs of the marketplace? What are the incentives that drive that? So So the issue is, are there partnerships? For instance, we have the Advanced Robotic Manufacturing Institute in Pittsburgh, which is a large DoD funded activity where there's Carnegie Mellon, but equally well, there is the community colleges in Allegheny County. There's a smaller universities like Robert Morris University that, when partnering with a university like CMU, can create content so that there's a continuum of different kinds of training appropriately suited for different levels of sophistication for different types of audiences. And so that's on the supply side. And on the demand side, I think there is both the aspect of, I think this issue of imparting this learning to learn, just like Paul talks about, firms are going to compete, and the ones that have learning organizations are going to do better than others. I think countries are going to compete on this as well. And if we as a society can outcompete others by building this capacity on learning to learn and having the frameworks where people can learn new things but also have the wherewithal, both time-wise and the money, to actually acquire those skills. That's why this is something that will span technology and public policy and social science on account of the fact that these solutions require a holistic understanding. So both on the supply side and on the demand side.
Yeah.
There's been some really good work done recently by policymakers, particularly at the state level where I spend a lot of work. The National Governors Association, your boss, former governor of Virginia, they've been doing, most recently, one of their initiatives was the Good Jobs for All initiative, where they took stock of what states were doing, rural, urban states, what schools were doing, what employers were doing, and really tried to find some synergies. And some of the takeaways of that is there really was a need for greater coordination between the different entities out there that are working. One thing I was really surprised to learn is just how much need is happening and how much people are relying, particularly in rural areas, which I know is a big concern to the senator and big issue for us in Virginia, where I live, is how to reach rural populations. One of the things I was surprised to learn was the role that ag extension agencies, these are used for agricultural needs for farmers, and they were playing a role in job training and job creation. So there's really a need to, for coordinating bodies like NGA, like the U.S. government, to really help make these connections and see these uses that are happening out there, and what tools we have to deliver the content, to leverage the training, to get these opportunities out to different populations. And I'm pleased to see it happening at the state level and us talking about it at the federal level too.
That's great.
The only thing I'd add to that, to those points, is I think there's other things we need to think about in terms of access. The internet's been around for 50 years now, and about a year ago we celebrated something called World Internet Day, which celebrated the fact that half the world's population has access to the internet, half don't. And if you look at implications of what we may be moving into with coronavirus and things happening, those that don't have digital access will be at a severe disadvantage in a lot of respects. I look at my own town. I live in just outside of New York City. My town has over 30% free and reduced lunch in the school systems. A lot of those children don't have laptops or internet access at home. So if we go to a study at home, what's going to happen to them? And so I think we have to think about the access issues. We also have to think about a trust issue. There's a big, we have a report out, our annual tech vision that I think there are copies of out there, where the title is "We the Post-Digital People." And the key theme, one of the key themes we're talking about in that vision is this idea of a post-digital world we're moving into as we adopt digital, and what changes. And one of the things that changes is the trust that we have with citizens, the trust that we have with consumers and companies, the trust that we have with our workers is really, really important, and the way that you build that trust is critical. From a societal perspective and from a U.S. perspective, things like our federal level privacy policy, that's moving in the right direction, protecting people's information in the right way is important. Access to certain technologies that are perceived to be used for bad purposes or create issues of trust. Facial recognition is an example that's hot right now. The way we deal with those are going to be very important to make sure we both innovate and that we do it in a way where people trust what we're doing in governments, in businesses, et cetera. And I think those two issues from a policy perspective are really important over the next few years.
Great. I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I think that brings it home a little bit, both that sort of trust piece for the broader American citizenry, making sure that companies are thinking about this as something that allows them to be competitive in the future. And my boss, if he were here, would probably talk about the security implications of this and how important that is as well. So at this point, I think it'd be great to open it up and get some questions from the audience for our panelists. So if anyone would like to start, please stand up and introduce yourself. I don't know if a microphone is going around the room or no. Okay. Yes. Okay, great. All right. Yep. Go ahead.
Hi, Lynn Wells from George Mason. On the issue of lifelong learning, nobody seems to disagree, but I was talking with a colleague who runs an IT center for a medium-sized business, and his point was, look, right now I'm working 60 hours a week. I've got, when I get home, I've got the grandkids, I got the car to work, whatever, and I just don't have the spare cycles to do this. I understand the importance, whatever, I just can't fit it in my life at the moment. And I'm just wondering how many other people would fall into that kind of category. I don't think anybody disagrees the value of lifelong learning. How do you actually implement it in the way people live today?
So the way we view that is embedding it in the way people work is the best answer. I mean, I think we need to do more work on to really answer that question. There's probably policy and other issues that we need to look at. Savings accounts, education savings accounts, and things to provide people with financial resources. But from a corporate perspective, the way we think about that is embedding in the way we work. So as people, so how do you have point-in-time learning or access learning at the point of need? So when you have an issue, you can access learning and solve your problems. So it's part of how you do your job. You learn more by doing more. The other thing we're doing a lot of is asking our people, what can we improve? So the way we're viewing artificial intelligence in our company is we're asking every one of our 500,000 people, what's something you're doing today that's kind of seems routine that you don't feel like you need to do that you can automate in a different way? And how do we work with you to automate that in the right way and then equip you with different skills that you can be more effective with the new job? How do you move from being a transaction, say a data entry or transaction processor, to somebody who can provide analytic advice based on the transactions you process? And I think that kind of evolution of the jobs and people learning as they're helping improve the business is the way we see it moving forward.
I think from my perspective, you hit the nail on the head of an issue that we saw when we were trying to train a company that's now, hundreds of thousands of employees. How do we give them these opportunities to learn when they want to work a full-time job? So one of the things we did with Career Choice was to bring the classroom experience to them. So you go to our fulfillment centers and you see these classrooms set up just like a classroom you'd find at a college or a university. And they are taught by local college faculty. The course schedules are such that workers can work their shifts and then have the class right there. They don't need to drive a distance. They don't need to worry about that. It's just right there. It's just one example. We continue to innovate and iterate on things, whether it's providing the content online, both internally and externally. Educate is available online 24/7, 365. For the students who want to consume that. It's something also very important to me. I work a full-time job. I have to travel a lot in my role. I'm trying to learn how to code. It is a lot of work, and one of the benefits I've seen is that I have through the coding, schools, Code Academy, Free Code Camp. I'm able to access my content on any device, anywhere in the world, anytime I'm available, which has been a big help. Not solved yet, but something we're going to continue working on.
So just a quick other response. I think for those of us from universities, we want to also have support for individuals who are motivated, who want to have these opportunities. Intensive mode courses have come about where people are sort of offering content in intensive mode, some combination of hybrid plus face-to-face that reduces sort of the frictions associated going, commuting long distances, etc. So I think there's lots of new ideas potentially to try and address these needs.
Mm-hmm. And if I could just sort of quickly point out that my boss has been talking about this from the perspective of rethinking workers going from costs in the 20th century to assets in the 21st century, and the idea that employers actually training and investing in worker training is actually supposed to be seen as sort of your competitive advantage in the 21st century. So he's introduced bills around worker training tax credits, for example, to incentivize companies to be really taking this on internally as well.
Yep.
So, other questions? Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Anthony Scriffignano from Dun & Bradstreet. I was wondering, thinking about two comments that were made separately. One about how many people check their phone before their feet hit the floor, and the other was the long list of disruptive future technologies, quantum computing and blockchain, and we can all do that. Take one breath and do a list of things that will disrupt us. We're not being disrupted by one of these things. We're just being disrupted by all of them. Education is in that category that's being disrupted. What do we teach now that's going to be relevant 2 or 3 years from now? And it's a very big question. The thing that strikes me is to connect this to the different frame that you just put on it, which is forget about the technology. We say, we're not suffering from an absence of AI or an absence of data. We're suffering from shifting the paradigm from our technology serving us to we're starting to serve it. Mm-hmm. Outlook tells me to go to a meeting and I go, right? So we have to learn how to ask different kinds of questions if we're going to get out in front of this. Otherwise, we're always going to be chasing the next disruptive technology. So I was wondering what you all think about how we teach as leaders. I think it's fair. I'll speak for myself. We're in the latter part of our career rather than the beginning part of our career. The one thing we can do to lead differently is to teach people who are up and coming in the organizations something, a little tough love. Like, you need to be able to ask a different kind of question. Not how can we use cloud, or not how can we use quantum. It's what is it that we're doing that has an unmet need, and maybe that's the answer to it. But we've got to start with the human need. We've got to start with the objective truth. And I think we're very good at leading with technology. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how we shift from leading with the technology to leading with the problem that's going to help.
If I might use a very old technology as an example, electricity, right? So when electricity was first introduced, we were in steam, and electricity was viewed as a big disruption. The initial attempts were to try and replicate what was done with steam, with electricity, before they figured out how to sort of not have to, that they could co-locate things. They didn't have to sort of, or they don't have to co-locate things because electricity permitted a very different style of redistribution of resources. So I think with many of these disruptive technologies, we're still in this realm of figuring out how do we rethink business processes? How do we rethink? So it's not about just applying the same technology to what we're doing currently. So I think there is that aspect of creative rethink and that will require questions to be asked versus sort of taking exactly what we have and just saying, okay, I want to do this via X, where X is your current favorite technology.
Yeah, as I said, I love the way you framed the question, which is how do you ask different questions? Because I think you answered your own question. It's about asking the questions. It is about asking questions differently. And that's one reason we wrote the book we wrote, is because we saw people asking the wrong questions. They were asking questions about AI, like how do I downsize my call center using AI? That's not the point. The point, what do you want to do through your call center? You want to serve customers more effectively. You want to increase your net promoter score, and you want to cross-sell your products more efficiently. If you look at it that way, you're going to apply the technology much differently to empower the people that need the human interaction. So I think training people to ask the right questions is key. The only other point I'd add is that we can't ignore what's happening now, and Christian mentioned this a minute at the start of with the coronavirus situation happening. I think we have an opportunity to get a lot of the questions reframed through what's happening now. And if you look at technology waves of adoption, crises often drive technology adoption. The Y2K, year 2000, dramatically accelerated the adoption of global ERP, global software packages, and globalization of IT in that way. Huge impact. The crisis of 2008, the financial crisis, led to the first major wave of cloud adoption in companies because of the elasticity and different values that they saw in deploying that technology. What's going to happen with the coronavirus and the reaction to it is I believe there's three things that it'll cause us to ask different questions on. One is ways of working. Do we need to work the way we do? How do we work differently? Working digitally, working at home, working remotely. It's going to introduce a new standard of working efficiently and differently in ways that are good for people. The second thing that's going to change is views around automation and how do we hyper-automate things, but hyper-automate them in a way that's resilient for people, not just eliminating people, and hyper-automate in a positive way, leveraging these technologies. And the third question is how do we change business processes that need to be resilient in these times, like supply chain and e-commerce are the two that I'd highlight, which will never go back to the way they were once you look at how once companies look at how they're going to adapt those processes to what's happening around the response to the coronavirus. So that's the other point I'd add.
I'll just briefly add, I agree with my fellow panelists and simply say, when Amazon looks at a problem, we just say, oh, we're going to throw a bunch of AI or technology at it. We say, okay, what's the customer's problem? How can we help solve that? And we are empowered, again, by our leadership principles to be all right a lot, to have good judgment about these things, to question the data that comes in, to question the anecdotes. Where there's inconsistencies, how do we reconcile them? And we look at what we do as a company. It would be wrong to say we're an e-commerce company or a cloud company. We're a customer-obsessed company. We want to start with the customer. We want to figure out their problems. It may be technology. It may be a process. It may be people. It may be different things. So from our perspective, we are empowering our employees to think differently, to think boldly, and look at what the data and anecdotes are saying. And I think my recommendation would be, whether you're a government organization, a nonprofit organization, a commercial organization, those clear mission statements, principles, philosophies of looking at the world, they need to be really carefully considered because the problem may not be a healthcare problem, an education problem. It could be something else. So really thinking carefully about it.
Okay. We might have 1 minute left. So Miriam, why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
Thank you. I can speak loudly. Miriam Vogel, I lead Equal AI. Thank you. And we focus on bias in AI, but we're very focused on the future of work as one of the best solutions to resolving the issues of bias in AI. And so, as Senator Warner has often pointed out, we don't have a sufficiently skilled population to continue to lead in this space. And so we have this critical juncture where we not only can make better AI with a broader cross-section of our population, but we have this mandate. We need all hands on deck. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, Dr. Krishnan, or from Paul, John, from the industry perspective, how can we do a better job of making sure we have a broader cross-section, upskilling, and preparing in the K through 12 so that we can continue to lead?
So from our perspective, absolutely agree with you that a lot of the challenges and questions that have been raised about new technologies are because we need to get more people from diverse backgrounds, more inclusive backgrounds into the technology space. We've got general programs, of course, AWS Educate and some of the others I talked about earlier, but we also are strong supporters of Girls Who Code, getting engineers from diverse backgrounds into the industry so they can build these products and help us, truly be a global customer-centric company. So absolutely agree that, we're doing what we can. We can do more, and happy to support those efforts.
So, Paul mentioned this in his earlier remarks. I think this question of trust, which is at the core of getting value at scale from AI, requires not only a focus just on algorithmic accountability and algorithmic bias, which has taken center stage, but perceptions of fairness, perceptions of how exactly the technology is serving the people it's supposed to serve. And for that, I think you need stakeholders involved in the actual process of creation and deployment. And for that, I think there's both the education piece, but also the creation of the technology and the vetting of it and the scoping and the deployment of it that should have a multi-stakeholder kind of lens to it.
Just add that I think that the ultimate answer, what we need to strive for, is an inclusive and diverse workforce that allows us to build the future in the right way. If you go back to my opening comment that we're transforming human experience, which is what we're doing, as we go through this time we're in, we better have the right population designing and building that world, and we don't have that now. So the work you're doing is important. I'm on the board of directors of Girls Who Code. We support code.org. We're supporting Fei Li's AI for All, Black in AI, just in that kind of community, in addition to many other organizations. And that's really important to get right. But there's also something around accountability for doing the right things that I think needs to be owned more by organizations working with technology. We're firm believers in responsible AI. We developed a responsible AI toolkit with the World Economic Forum that we're trying to spread to companies. We're doing data salons, data salon work that we're rolling out with the Atlantic Council to focus on these issues around data and how to look at data in the right way. And there needs to be accountability for companies that if you're using AI, if you're using these technologies, be sure and be accountable that you're doing it in the right way. And there's too many examples where companies aren't doing that. And we think it's very manageable for companies to own it and do it right, but we need to better spread those practices.
Okay. All right, thank you. Our time is up, unfortunately, but I wanted to thank the Atlantic Council for the invitation, all of the work that the GeoTech Center is going to be doing on this, and then thank you to the panelists for joining me today. Thank you.
So if I could thank again, a round of applause for our esteemed panelists and moderators. Our world is truly changing. 2013 was the year we made history, and probably most people did not notice it. There were 7.1 billion human beings on the planet and 7.1 billion network devices on the planet as well, not all connected to the internet. More than 2 years later, 2015, we'd gone up to 14 billion network devices and 7.3 billion human beings. We're now at about 45 billion network devices relative to 7.6 billion human beings. And in the next 2 years, conservatively, we're probably going to have 10 network devices for every human being on the planet. In terms of data, in 2013, we were at 4 zettabytes. Anybody know what a zettabyte is? Yay, I know I have my crowd when some people do. It's 1 billion terabytes. And to put that in perspective, the Hubble telescope in an entire year does 10 terabytes of data. So in 2013, we had the equivalent of 400 million versions of the Hubble telescope. Some of those, of course, were cat videos. But that was 2013. Looking at 2025, less than 5 years from now, we're looking at 150 zettabytes, 150 billion terabytes of data, which some say is 3 times all the conversations we've ever had as a species. We are drowning in data. So that sets the stage now for what we think about in terms of what data can do for the biological sciences, for supply chains, and most importantly, the economies of trust. And so I'd like to invite to the stage Dr. Cathy Newcomer from GW to serve as moderator. In addition, the Honorable Jane Holl Lute from SICPA and Matthew Putnam from Nanotronics. And I will be joining as well to join us here at the stage. I think, Cathy, you are there. Come on up.
Yeah, I heard. Okay. I am delighted to be here. I probably came the least amount of distance. I'm right here at George Washington University and have been developing leaders for public service for many years there. But I am really, not only am I honored and delighted to be here, but I'm really honored and delighted to be on this stage. Now, you can read their full bios, but not only are these 3 accomplished leaders, PhDs from fantastic schools, had a series of amazing jobs, but Jane was an Army officer. She served, yeah, and served in Republican and Democratic administrations. Hey, that's pretty cool. So Matthew, not only is he a pianist, he's a published poet and has over 50 patents. I mean, this is like pretty amazing. And thanks. Did you know that David started his career at 15 working in a high energy physics lab? That's it's pretty amazing. And he actually lectures on disruption with TED Talks and things. Who does that? You know, I mean, we have amazing talent up here. And we couldn't have kind of planned the relevance of this topic better had we known. And obviously, this was planned way before anybody had heard of the coronavirus. But we're going to be talking about supply chain issues, not only technological issues, but trust issues. As we have technological advances, we also have very interesting questions that arise clearly about ethics and trust. So I'm going to ask Jane first. Okay. To address the question, what are some exciting advances either in counter fraud activities or efforts to improve the trust associated with the delivery of goods and services?
No, thanks. And it really is a pleasure and an honor to be here. And I'm just further evidence that every ladder has a bottom rung. I think if we're going to examine that question, we really need to know what we're talking about when we talk about trust. I mean, it's a word that we take for granted. I thought the first panel really set this panel up very well in raising it in the context that it did. But if we take a step back, and I think we're living in an era of a global cyber awakening. I mean, we have a global population that is more educated, living longer, healthier, wealthier, more politically active, more mobile than at any point in history, including larger, 7.1 billion. And we're all connected. I mean, we're all connected to each other and to information. I've spent a lot of time in the UN. You can go literally to the middle of the Congo and get cell service. And you could do that for the past 20 years. And cell phones are cheap, they're ubiquitous, and connectivity and information is really everywhere. This global cyber awakening is deeply, deeply empowering. We like it and we want more. But it's coinciding with a near total collapse of trust in public sector institutions. But this collapse of trust is really, there's a certain irony of it in it to me. I mean, how many of us trust our banks? Most of us. How many of us trust bankers? Fewer than most of us, okay? How many of us trust the economy, even today? More or less, right? How many of us trust economists? Not so much. How many trust our member of Congress? Almost all of us. How many of us trust Congress? Not all of us. I mean, this is really remarkable. So trust is disintegrating in a way that I don't think we're really having a full and intelligent, if I can use that word, conversation about. I mean, we're sort of waving our hands, like when I was in the Army, we used to say, this is Africa, big hand, little map. Okay, let's unpack that, right? Not your hand so much, the map. And really our points of reference for trust are highly contextualized. I trust you for this purpose. I trust you on this day. I trust that you won't let me down, or whatever. And so this whole question of trust for us at SICPA, and SICPA is, as Fred says, the largest little company you've heard of. We make the material security technology for most of the world's banknotes. So do you trust the banknotes in your pocket? You trust SICPA. Now, I didn't really intend for that little commercial, but it kind of fit well. I might use it again. I might use it again. But the point is when we think about trust, what are the attributes of something that cause us to trust it? Is it because we know? Well, currency is anonymous. You can use that currency. You can give it to me. Nobody knows you had it or that I have it now on any particular piece of currency, but you trust it. So as we think about trust in the supply chain or in any other, whether it's the supply chain of information or even the supply chain of trouble, which is something that I got to know very well when I was at the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Defense. The supply chain of trouble has a supply chain, right? There are raw materials, there are middlemen and women, there are end users of trouble. And so I think about every supply chain and how we have trust and confidence. How do we know that something has been lawfully acquired? How do we know that, can we prove the origin of something? Is this what I think it is? How do I know? Those are the core issues for me that begin any trust conversation.
Okay, that's...
Did I answer your question?
I'm impressed. So let's turn to Matthew, okay, and talk a little bit more about interesting new technologies that are both technologies and data that are advancing the supply chain. What are you most optimistic about?
Well, to speak a little bit to what the previous panel, I'm really optimistic about humans being able to create because of new technologies. It has been amazing to see this last industrial revolution, the one we're for the third industrial revolution, to have this communication lines across the world to be able to enable trade and communications. But now there's an opportunity to be more distributed about it. And I look at world events right now and I think this is incredibly useful. So you could think about the way that a 3D printer works, for instance. And imagine if it had the kind of precision that other types of machines had. And you could send information from many different places and humans could create by using those. It becomes a very different world. So if you think of that as sort of a miniature version of what factories and manufacturing, which is what I'm interested in, how do we build the foundational technologies for the next industrial revolution? This is sort of the mental model I have. And this only happens if we start using artificial intelligence that are being used for consumer technologies. We talked about Alexa, or things that were used for things like AlphaGo, where the greatest Go player was defeated. If you start using that to build things and take advantage of all the incredible amounts of information that David spoke about, then you have a whole different way of dealing with creativity. You have an entire different way of collaborating with machines. And that only comes from this really manufacturing and artificial intelligence combined.
Okay. So why don't we continue down with David? What do you think are the most exciting advances that we have along the way, and what are some of the key choices, pivotal decisions, choices?
So to build on what both Jane and Matthew said, I think we really want to figure out where do we want to go as a society. As mentioned, we're seeing eroding distrust. We're seeing eroding trust and increasing distrust in people and institutions. And it's not just public, it's also private sector in some respects. And I would actually frame it, unfortunately he couldn't be here, but one of the commissioners on the commission is going to be Sue Gordon. I would actually use how she framed things, saying, what if we're in a world in which things that used to be done by the public sector can't solely be done by the public sector now because of what's changing with supply chains, what's changing with the nature of data and work. And so things now have to be done in partnership with the private sector. But at the same time, the private sector has a hard time explaining anything other than returns on investment and increasing shareholder value. And at the same time, in the midst of all this, while you have the public sector and the private sector figuring out how to work together, you now also have a public that doesn't trust either sector to do it. And if that's a challenge we face in open societies like the United States, will those more authoritarian, totalitarian regimes possibly have a short-term advantage because they don't separate their public from the private sector? Now, at the same time, if we can figure out where we want to go as a society, then we can find out opportunities to collaborate. So it's not a purely competitive relationship even with those countries as well. But we first have to figure out where we want to go when it comes to using supply chains to advance the future of health, to advance the future of space, to advance just the future of how we work together. And we've really not had that conversation. And a deeper conversation we need to even ask is, does the very short-termism associated with either elections or short-termism in terms of quarterly earnings make it hard for us to be long-term in what we do? And that's why I was excited when Fred gave the offer to come out with the Atlantic Council. But we really do need to figure out where do we want to go together, and it's got to be across multiple sectors, because that's the only way we'll be strong together. And so for me, it really is trying to figure out how we're going to measure it, how we're going to move forward, because then that removes the conversation. Once you can figure out where you want to go and how you're going to measure it, it can be done by any partner. And it can be done with allies as well as people that you might not necessarily see as allies. And then the last thing I would say, and I think this is channeling both what the previous panel said and our speaker remarks, President Lincoln once said, "I do not like that person. I must get to know them better." I want to celebrate that last part, which is I must get to know them better. Obviously, we're going to have differences of opinion as to where we need to go. But I feel like in today's age, in which the good news is you can print or read anything on the internet, the bad news is you can print and read anything on the internet, we've got to figure out the same thing in terms of, can we at least have empathy as to why certain people are motivated a certain way, whether it comes to digital technologies or personalized medicine. The good news is there's going to be personalized medicine. The bad news is there's going to be personalized medicine. The good news is there's going to be 3D printing. The challenging news is there's going to be 3D printing. We've got to figure out where we want to go together.
So to make it real, with the COVID-19, the coronavirus, supply chains are being disrupted. So right now we need ideas, and we need them fast. So I can't think of anybody else I'd rather ask this question to, but how can we use new technologies and data to deal and minimize the disruptions? Anybody can go. This is the extra credit question.
Yeah, maybe I'll begin, because I think something David said struck me. You know, when I tell my daughters, whenever you're in trouble, don't trust your feelings, trust your values. Don't respond to your feelings, respond from your values. And because you can trust your values, why can you trust them? And there's this sort of, I'm not a psychologist, but it feels like the best thing to say under the circumstances when they run into bad things happening. But when I think about the economy of trust, that's what you're really talking about. I don't know if trust has economies, but it certainly, there is an economy to trust. There is an economy of trust, right? What does that mean? Well, if an economy is where we make and exchange things of value using tools in equity and in law, okay, that's basically an economy. Is trust something of value to us? It absolutely is. It reduces transaction costs, and importantly, it reduces anxiety. I mean, we'll get lots of masks and lots of, hand sanitizers and stuff pumping into the marketplace now. Do you trust them all? A few of the names you do, but not all of them. Where did it come from? How was it acquired? Who has looked at this for safety standards? And so all of that now, where are we assigning the burden of proof when it comes to our placing trust? David, I think both of you spoke about the importance of the private sector in terms of innovation and adapting human lifestyle to the technologies that we're facing. It's absolutely true. And for those of us who have spent most of our time in government, we know that governments cannot, by a long shot, do all that needs doing. Absolutely not by a long shot. And there are sectors of government that are quite used to not only turning to the private sector, but relying on it. Ask any mayor. It's how they get business done. They turn to their private sector, both the not-for-profit and the for-profit, and they say, help us. And they always respond. The question that we have to introduce here is, what are the new tools of accountability that we will use? Because the private sector is not used to being accountable, that is, having to answer to, being above the fold and under the gun every single day. And what we're seeing, I mean, coming out of the Business Roundtable, for example, recently, this latest statement about corporate governance and attentiveness to ESG is just this recognition that the social effects of business and the growth in the economy have to be taken account.
Yeah, I think that, I don't know, I tend to think, I heard David's comment about long-term planning. And when something like this happens, and we're worried about who we're going to be on the street next to, we're worried about our own family getting sick, it's suddenly you have to have long-term planning with this short-term urgency, this incredible amount of urgency. And that way, what that does is let us turn to things that have been developed, whether it's by individuals or governments or corporations, that have been, waiting for something to push it along. And we're going to see this happen now with some biologics and gene therapy. We're certainly going to see it happen with artificial intelligence and being able to do diagnostics in different ways. And we're going to have to see it in how we build things. So, as was spoken about a bit earlier by the Congressman, there's a lot of materials that the United States just does not have access to. We don't own these materials, and we're part of a supply chain that makes that possible, and it's been wonderful for 20th century and 21st century commerce. However, when that stops, either because of something like a pathogen, a contagion, or a trade war, or any other type of escalating tensions, we have to figure out what we can do about it, and how we handle it. There are materials right now that do exist in the United States, but don't exist at scale. So things, for instance, there's LEDs that use a different ultraviolet, and it's really good for surface, for cleaning surfaces and for water purification. These have been around for a long time, but they've generally been more expensive and hard to make. If we can bring down the cost of that by having feedback loops with AI that has been developed, then we can suddenly start to make these at scale. And we can make these at scale tomorrow if there's enough effort put into it and some resources. It's not even an enormous amount of resources. It's some resources that long-term planning on the science is already done and some short-term urgency to build it.
And to amplify both what Matthew and Jane is saying, in some respects, COVID might actually serve as a rallying call across sectors because now we have a clear thing to address, that we know it's disrupting our economies, we know it's disrupting our societies. And so, yes, there may be different motivations from the public sector versus the private sector in terms of end results, but everybody wants to see us get through this and get back to living in a more normal world. And so one of the things that I think about, and I often have conversations with Vint Cerf about, when he worked to help make TCP/IP, when he worked to make it available to the public, he didn't necessarily see all the good, but also all the other things that are being used with the internet. But one thing that I would actually ask people in the audience right now is, how many of you know more people online do you know in your immediate neighborhood? That is a consequence of the internet. But maybe COVID will change that because you may need to get to know your neighbors because you're going to get through it together. Not that I would ever wish for this to happen as the forcing function, but maybe that actually could be something that occurs. Go ahead, Jane.
Well, the only thing I was going to say is, parents socialize where they work, kids socialize where they live.
Yes.
So there would probably be a different answer,
probably,
from your kids as opposed to your parents. The other thing that I think is really important about this, I mean, if you look at where we are in a crisis, right? And I've dealt with a lot of international crises in particular, and domestic crises, hurricanes and tornadoes, floods and fires and things. And what you discover is there's a real focus on commodities. Let's get people shelter, let's get them food, let's get them, the things that they need. Well, information is a commodity in a crisis, because if you don't have an informed population, you don't have a stable population. And information is a component of the supply chain that is often overlooked. Where did this thing come from? I mean, the world consists of stuff, as Matthew said, and transactions about stuff, and data and information about those transactions and that stuff. And we're inundated with it right now. And we are assigned the responsibility of curating not only our own things and our own information, but the authenticity of those things and information. And frankly, I'm exhausted. I mean, I don't know about you, but it's exhausting. And our typical surrogates that we have used, institutions, authorities, individuals, I mean, whatever Tony Fauci says, I believe. I would bet on, you know, I mean, whatever he says. And that was true when we were dealing with H1N1 more than 10 years ago now, because he's just an authoritative, he's a great guy, very funny, you know, from my neck of the woods. But he just, I mean, you can just take that to the bank. And so how do we bottle that? What is that he's got, and I'm using this as an example, but that we can re-infuse our institutions with along the supply chain, because they are simply no longer weight-bearing for the expectations that we're piling on them.
I agree. Trust is so essential, and everything you said is things that we're talking about in schools of public policy and public administration as leaders of these schools that are trying to produce the leaders of tomorrow. They're going out into a very, very different world, and the question is, how do you develop the kind of trust, you're right, that we have in some of our leaders?
Real quick, Cathy, sort of, and maybe to add on what Jane was saying, and also turn a little bit to Matthew. With additive manufacturing, with 3D printing, we know there's going to be, whether it's hospital equipment or other gear, where things are going to break and we're going to need to be able to replace those parts. And if we can't physically find the parts, the question is, can we use computer vision to scan what the part should look like and manufacture it? And so, Matthew, I'd be interested in your thoughts with that.
Well, I think we can. And we've actually done this work in labs and are working with other companies now. It's holding yourself to the standard of no waste at all seems like an environmental statement, and it is. It's certainly about waste in the environment, but it's also about making sure that you're not stuck with something and a loss, right? So whether it's a loss of human potential or a loss of material. This is what collaborating on AI closed-loop manufacturing process lets you do. You can 3D print a new printer, but you can't do it alone.
Right.
We're
not there yet.
Where those mistakes would be.
Yep.
But an AI has something called reinforcement learning, which we did see with AlphaGo. We use reinforcement learning to give rewards and penalize AIs for being able to create those things as well as possible. That's a pretty big change in the way things are looked at. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think building things and not being vulnerable is, we all feel very vulnerable right now. Yeah. And I mean, I still feel it, so I feel that urgency and that call to change, but it's that call.
Right. And I like that you said vulnerable, because trust I would define is the willingness to be vulnerable to someone you can't control.
The thing that concerns me is with 3D printing, for example, is that anybody can do anything at any time, whenever they want. And so how do the rest of us know that it's any good? I mean, one of the things that SIGPA does is we make these state-of-the-art material security, submolecular, identifiers. I mean, you can burn a $100 bill to a crisp. You can burn it to a pile of ashes, and we can tell you whether or not it was the real deal. And so again, that's how we know. So the capability to do things does not infuse them, and you're not suggesting this, doesn't infuse them with our ability to trust them. And so, when something, if we're looking for O-rings, for Challenger launchers, if we're looking for spare parts in automobiles, if we're looking for, medicines, if we're looking for foods, on a recall, for example, how do we know? We have completely atomized the production process. The supply chain truly is global, it's truly atomized, and trust has not traveled along the same road.
Right, we need to do this on a foundational level now, but we can. So I always choose, even with any risk, I tend to be, David's an optimist, I tend to go even one step further and be kind of a utopian about these things.
I told you every letter has a bottom.
I might have watched too much Star Trek and wanted to create a replicator, but certainly quality measures are built into the system. An AI, for instance, has checks on itself. And there's new forms of AI where you have competing AIs that have checks on themselves. And ultimately, people, to the statistics you're talking about, the more freedom we tend to have, the more we tend to do things for good. Now, that's not absolute, but when you look at right now what we're dealing with the coronavirus, and it happens with other infectious disease, there's an incredible alignment amongst humans that we need to solve this, and amongst countries. So the trust that if everybody was empowered to try to build something for that, and has safety measures built in by its very nature, and those can be checked, and there's all sorts of interesting ways, if we had time to get into it, how to check hardware, and sort of, we say, on the other side of where a firewall would exist, for instance, or other cybersecurity measures. Then you actually do have a chance to more quickly solve problems like this. And that points to personalized medicine being one of them, but personal diagnostics being another.
Exactly.
We have time for questions from the audience. Please ask some more hard questions, please.
Yes, we love hard questions. Anthony, I know you've got one. Let's get you a microphone real quick. Here it comes.
Thank you. This is along the lines of your Star Trek comment. I was wondering if you could opine a bit on goal modification in AI. So right now, reinforcement is the closest we have, allowing things to compete and maybe find a different way to get there than we anticipated. We're still kind of iffy about letting them change where they think they're going. Autonomous devices and certain use cases are going to force us there. I was wondering if any of you could opine on your thoughts.
You want me to go first? I'll jump on a hand grenade. Thank you, Anthony.
Thanks for that.
So yes, goal modification right now, it is a precipice. I would say the good news is, despite what everyone tells you, we aren't at the Terminator stage. Machine learning, neural networks, they cannot change their goals. So whatever you've told them is your optimizing goal, they will optimize towards. I do think we need to be very deliberate and intentional about having a conversation about allowing a machine to modify its goal. I would feel much more comfortable if it was optimizing and changing a sub-goal and the weight of a sub-goal. Changing its own goal, that gets very interesting and very tricky. So I think right now, the good news is we're not there yet, but this is exactly why we need to assemble public and private sector now, because it may very well be 6 months from now we get a conversation and guess what? Company X has been able to do this and so yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Deep learning is amazing for building things right now, but it can't change its goals. So this is where it becomes a community thing, is that we have to make sure that we're setting the right utility function.
What are the goals? Yes.
What are our goals? And so after speaking as such an optimist, most people aren't going to make a goal that's inherently bad. Some will. But figuring out what we want the world to be is still up to us. Our AIs are getting so good at reaching those by using things like reinforcement learning, but we still need to figure out who we are.
Agreed.
So what's so interesting about this, I'm reminded of a conversation I had with Vint, about when they were first putting this thing we call the internet today sort of together. They never really fully imagined people would use it for bad things.
Right.
Because it was really designed to be a great thing. And it is a great thing. It's extraordinary. But, what we know is, even with this extraordinary technologies, do companies always tell us what their technologies are capable of? What their products do? Do governments always tell us? No, the answer is they don't. And they may have good reasons for doing so, but that doesn't mean they're doing a good thing. I am less optimistic. When we say we, I think the obvious question to this audience is, who's we? There's a lot, is it the white Western world? Is that we? Is it the other 6 billion people on the planet? Who is we, and how do we manifest values, not feelings, in these capabilities that I agree are astounding and getting better? And when it comes to goal reorientation or goal change, I don't just have one word for you. How?
Mm-hmm. And I think to build on what you were saying,
and really. When I say data from Star Trek. So.
Well, and I would say, Jane, you hit the nail on the head in terms of who is we, And I think one of the things we've been very deliberate about with framing the GeoTech Center is we use the word good tech choices. But we're really trying to emphasize the choices part, because if you ask what are we standing for, we are carrying the banner of making sure you have a choice with everything that's coming. And that can be borderless, and it should be borderless, and it can be stronger with allies, can be stronger with even ones that maybe are unconventional partners. But it's making sure that as we move forward, and I think we've got about 5 years to get it right. Otherwise, it may very well be through a combination of what's happening in the digital space, but also the biological and manufacturing space, choice may become increasingly an illusion versus something that we actually have the ability to exercise.
I don't think choice is an illusion, but I think we live in an environment of constrained choice, right? And we do that, we opt into that environment, we're born into that environment, and those of us who stay in it, I mean, that's where we exist. People talk about political will. I think that's a vacuous, uninforming, and uninstructive concept. I think it's a question of constrained choice and you know, value satisficing, whatever phrases you want to use. If this is equipping us to know things sooner and to choose sooner,
Right.
I mean, that really presents obligations, I think, and that's a whole nother conversation.
Agreed, as long as though it's choosing between at least A and B as opposed to you only have A. So I agree with you that it is constrained choice or choice architectures, but you still have a choice that if I don't show all my data, maybe I can't get on that airplane faster, or maybe I can't even get on that airplane, but if I do, I can. It's at least having that choice.
Another question from the audience over there.
Got one back here. I got one there too.
Hi, I'm Nicola Revere, master's student at the Harvard Kennedy School and also a dual degree MBA at Wharton. So earlier you talked about empathy, and so we thought that internet, social media, YouTube, things like that would perhaps bridge this gap and make us more empathic. So my question here, though, is I think as we're seeing rising levels of economic inequality, one might argue that institutions are actually not doing better with empathy. So I'm kind of curious to hear from any of you, how do you, from an institutional standpoint, whether this is a private sector company or a government agency or a think tank or a foundation, how do you do a better job of institutionally thinking about kind of the most marginalized communities, thinking about the people on the ground that we seem to at times be forgetting and moving past?
So I would say first, you're absolutely right that it seems like we are becoming less empathetic online. And having worked with different folks, including Ben, on this, anyone know what the number one way is to make something go viral on the internet? Unfortunately, it's to make it angry. The number two way is to make it fearful. And it's not to make everybody angry. If you make it everybody angry, it quickly dies out. It's about making one group angry and the other group angry in response, so it self-propagates back and forth. Now, the companies that have rolled out these different products, obviously they're not trying to optimize for that, but they are trying to optimize for engagement. And unfortunately for human engagement, anger and fear turns out to be the way that overrides our brains and keeps pulling us back. And so at the end of the day, sort of like you said, Matthew, we need to learn more about ourselves, both as individuals and as groups, because we may discover that our brains were not even ready for the internet, let alone all these other technologies we're writing out. And so we've got to figure out how we have that understanding of human beings so that when we do roll out these products, we're amplifying the good in humans and ideally not the downside.
So I think about this question in the context of violent conflict and persistent conflict or for succeeding generations. And I've dealt with a lot of these. And this question of empathy comes up a lot. You know, it's you know, everyone starts out, well, you know, you don't understand. They understand perfectly well. They don't like it very much. I mean, that's what we see here. Well, they lack empathy. And I've thought a lot about this, and I'm not a psychologist by any means. And as empathy, I can put myself in your shoes. I am in your shoes, otherwise I would have won, right? I mean, so we're still struggling this. What it really comes down to for me is an unwillingness to acknowledge the legitimacy of another's aspirations. You know, again, I tell my daughters, look, he's great. Does he value you on your terms? Because if you're not valued on your terms, dump the chump. You know?
There you go.
I mean, it's just, you know, so I think, you know, from a policy point of view, what I want to try and do is take empathy and turn it into something, okay, what does this mean I do?
Yep.
And when people lack the ability to acknowledge the legitimacy of another's aspirations, you will have a persistent fight, whether they're empathetic or not.
I think we have one last question over there.
So as we proceed to the world of VR, MR, XR, whatever, which has the potential to fractionate ourselves even more in our own little stovepipes. How do you get around that as you build this empathetic world?
Well, I think that we're early in this too, but I have a chance to right now work in a room in a VR setting with my colleagues in California and New York, if I'd like to. That is one step closer to just being able to type an angry tweet at them. So there's definitely leading to it. You do see the potential, and you see the potential to be able to build at a distance. I don't think we're close to that in VR. I think in AR there's some really interesting things. We can teach craftsmanship in a different way, and we're doing that. How do you build things? If you're a craftsman shoe builder in Italy, how can we be able to do this here? Augmented reality can guide you and let you do these kinds of things. And that's already getting there. So I think there's great potential. I don't think it removes us as much. I think it can, in the same way that people would say that gaming either moves us back or moves it towards the player you're playing against.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes?
Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Thank you, Jack.
So as David Bray said, fear, anger can animate the brain, but so can a glass of champagne. And so I'm going to bring this to a close and then officially launch the GeoTech Center with a toast. First of all, let me just say what an amazing group of thinkers and doers in this room, which is really impressive, and thank you so much for being here. We were asked some provocative questions. Do you use your phone or your feet first in the morning? Do you trust your bank more than you trust your bankers? We were advised by Jane Hall Lute, if not valued, to dump the chump. Dun & Bradstreet even asked us whether we're asking the right question. As John Goodman whispered in my ear at one point, we heard our own David Bray geek out on big data. I whispered back to him, there's going to be a lot of geeking out at the GeoTech Center. We heard Congressman Mccaul warn us about the Chinese, and we heard a moving call for lifelong learning for more human technology and more human humans. I want to also note that Matthew Putnam pointed us toward the need in these times for short-term urgency backed by long-term planning. And I think we got our first project suggestion of this nature toward developing a utopian replicator. So we're gonna get to work on that. I'm not sure I think that can probably use nanotechnology as well. So finally, I'm going to raise a toast to the GeoTech Center, to the GeoTech Commission, to our founding partners, to our new director. First with a Paul Doherty quote. It's in our hands to shape shape the right path. Technology can be used for good and bad. And I think if there's a single quote for this center, it probably is shaping this right, or as David Bray said, making good tech choices. So let's raise a toast to all of you, to everything I was just raising a toast to, and to good tech choices. We will see you in real life and virtually often in the coming year. Thank you so much.